left with no name and no future. A lonely rancher. Gave her his name and changed everything forever. The dust kicked up by her worn boots settled slowly in the afternoon heat as she walked into Redemption Creek, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart heavy with secrets she could never speak aloud. The townspeople barely glanced her way, accustomed as they were to drifters and those running from something they'd rather forget. She pulled her faded bonnet lower over her face, not from the sun, but from the shame that burned hotter than any desert wind. Clara, though that wasn't the name she'd been born with, had been walking for 3 days straight, surviving on creek water and wild berries, her stomach gnawing at itself with hunger. The baby growing inside her seemed to demand more than she could give, and she pressed a protective hand to her barely showing belly as she surveyed the small frontier town. Redemption Creek wasn't much to look at, just a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. But it had what she needed most, the possibility of disappearing into anonymity. The general store's bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and the proprietor, a kindly woman with silver hair, pulled back in a neat bun, looked up from her ledger. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her eyes taking in Clara's disheveled appearance with concern rather than judgment. "I'm looking for work," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Any kind of work." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Henderson, shook her head sadly. "Times are hard, child. Most folks around here are barely getting by themselves." She paused, studying Clara's face. "But there might be something. Thomas Whitmore's been looking for help out at his ranch. Lost his wife last winter, and he's been struggling to keep up with everything on his own." Clara's heart sank at the mention of a widower. She'd learned the hard way that men without wives often expected more than honest labor from desperate women. But she nodded anyway, because she had no choice. "How do I find him?" "His spread's about 5 miles west of town. Follow the creek until you see the broken windmill, then head north. You can't miss it." Mrs. Henderson reached under the counter and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Take this bread with you. You look like you haven't eaten in days." Clara's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to, dear. Sometimes we all need a helping hand." The walk to the Whitmore ranch gave Clara time to think about what she would say, how she would present herself. She'd had practice at reinventing her identity, at creating stories that explained away the inconvenient truths of her past. She was 19 years old, though she felt decades older, and pregnant with a child whose father would never claim either of them. The last town had made it clear that unwed mothers weren't welcome, no matter how hard they worked or how quietly they kept to themselves. The ranch came into view as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. It was larger than she'd expected, with a main house that had seen better days, but still stood proud against the endless sky. Cattle dotted the pastures, and she could see a man working near the barn, his movements economical and purposeful. Thomas Whitmore was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and hands that spoke of hard work and honest labor. When he looked up at her approach, she saw eyes the color of storm clouds, filled with a weariness that matched her own. "You looking for someone?" he asked, setting down the harness he'd been mending. "Mrs. Henderson in town said you might have work. I'm Clara." She caught herself before saying the surname that belonged to her former life. "Clara Nash," she finished, choosing a name that sounded respectable and forgettable. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and she braced herself for the questions that always came. "Where are you from? What brings you here? Why are you alone?" Instead, he simply nodded. "Can you cook?" "Yes, sir." "Clean house? Tend a garden?" "Yes, to both." "I can offer you room and board and a small wage. The work's honest, and I won't bother you with questions you don't want to answer." He paused, and something in his expression softened. We all got reasons for being where we are. That first evening in the small room off the kitchen that Thomas had prepared for her, Clara lay on the narrow bed and allowed herself to cry for the first time in weeks. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finding shelter, of being treated with basic human dignity. Through the thin walls, she could hear Thomas moving around the main house, his footsteps heavy with fatigue. The next morning, she rose before dawn and had breakfast ready when he came in from the early chores. He paused in the doorway of the kitchen, surprise flickering across his features. "You didn't have to." "It's what you're paying me for," she said quietly, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before him. As the weeks passed, Clara threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised even her. She scrubbed the house from top to bottom, mended curtains and darned socks, tended the small vegetable garden that Thomas's wife Emma had started but which had been neglected since her death. The physical labor felt good, purposeful, and slowly the constant knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. Thomas was a man of few words, but Clara came to understand that his silence wasn't unfriendly. He was grieving, she realized, carrying his own burden of loss and regret. Sometimes she would catch him staring at nothing, his meal forgotten before him, and she would quietly clear his plate without comment. They developed an easy routine, like two wounded creatures who had found solace in each other's presence without the need for explanations. It was during her second month at the ranch that Clara began to show more obviously. She tried to hide it with loose clothing and careful positioning, but she knew it was only a matter of time before Thomas noticed. The morning sickness had passed, replaced by a growing appetite and the first fluttering movements of the baby. She was hanging laundry on the line when Thomas approached, his hat in his hands. "Clara, we need to talk." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned to face him. This was it, the moment when her carefully constructed peace would crumble. "Yes, sir?" "You're with child." It wasn't a question, and she saw no point in denying it. "Yes." "The father?" "Gone." The word came out harder than she intended. "Won't be coming back." Thomas nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "You got family? People who'll help?" Clara shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Well then," Thomas said after a long pause, "I reckon we'll need to get a cradle built." He put his hat back on and started to walk away, then stopped. "Clara, you're safe here, for as long as you need." The words broke something loose inside her chest, and she had to grip the clothesline to keep from falling to her knees. She had expected judgment, condemnation, dismissal. Instead, she had found acceptance from a man who barely knew her. As her pregnancy progressed, Thomas began to take on more of the physical tasks, insisting that she rest more often. He built the promised cradle with his own hands, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. Clara would sit nearby, mending clothes or preparing vegetables for the next day's meals, and they would talk, tentatively at first, then with growing trust. She learned that Thomas had inherited the ranch from his father, that he and Emma had been childhood sweethearts, who had dreamed of filling their home with children. Emma had died in childbirth, the baby with her, and Thomas had been living in the shadow of that loss ever since. He spoke of his wife with reverence and pain, and Clara found herself envying a woman she had never met for being so completely loved. "She would have liked you," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Emma had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." "I don't know that there's much good to see in me," Clara replied, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "You're wrong about that." Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. "I've watched you these past months, the way you care for things, the way you never complain, no matter how hard the work gets, the way you've brought life back to this place." He gestured toward the flourishing garden, the clean windows that sparkled in the fading light. "That takes a good heart." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You don't know what I've done. The choices I've made don't matter to me. What matters is who you are now, here, today." When her labor pains began on a cold February morning, Thomas rode hard to town to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, who served as the local midwife. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and fear, but through it all, Thomas remained close by, offering water and encouragement, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. When her daughter finally arrived, healthy and squalling with indignation at being thrust into the world, Clara held her and wept. She had expected to feel joy, relief, completion. Instead, She felt only a crushing weight of responsibility and love so fierce it terrified her. "She's beautiful," Thomas said softly, peering at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. "What will you call her?" "Hope," Clara whispered. "Her name is Hope." In the days that followed, Thomas took over most of the household duties, insisting that Clara rest and recover. He proved surprisingly adept at domestic tasks, and Clara often found herself watching him through the window as he hung laundry or tended the garden, baby Hope sleeping peacefully in a basket nearby. It was during one of these quiet moments that the riders appeared on the horizon. Clara's blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead horseman, Jake Morrison, the man who had fathered her child and then abandoned her when she'd told him about the pregnancy. He was accompanied by two other men, both wearing deputy badges that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Thomas must have seen them too, because he appeared at her side within moments. "You know them?" "The one in front? He's—" Clara's voice failed her. "He's Hope's father." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "What does he want?" "I don't know. Nothing good." The men reined in their horses in front of the house, and Jake Morrison dismounted with the casual arrogance Clara remembered too well. He was handsome in a cold, calculating way, with pale eyes that seemed to strip away pretense and find the weakness underneath. "Well, well," Jake said, his gaze moving between Clara and Thomas. "If it isn't my dear Clara, you've led me quite a chase, darling." "I have nothing to say to you," Clara said, unconsciously moving closer to Thomas. "Now, that's not very friendly, especially considering you've got something that belongs to me." Jake's eyes moved to the basket where Hope slept. "My child." "She's not yours," Clara said fiercely. "You made that clear when you told me to get rid of her and disappeared." "Well, I've had a change of heart. My dear wife. Yes, I got married, Clara, to someone more suitable. Can't seem to carry a child to term. So I've come to collect what's mine." One of the deputies stepped forward. "Ma'am, Mr. Morrison here has legal papers. As the father, he's got rights to the child." Thomas moved slightly, placing himself between Clara and the men. "This is my land, and Clara and the baby are under my protection. I'll thank you to state your business and move on." Jake laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your protection? This woman is nothing but a whore who tried to trap me with a bastard child. What kind of protection can you offer?" The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one designed to wound and humiliate. She saw Thomas's hands clench into fists, and she placed a restraining hand on his arm. Violence wouldn't solve this problem. "She's not a whore," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "She's my wife." The words hung in the air, like a thunderclap. Clara stared at Thomas in shock, while Jake's face darkened with rage. "Your wife?" "That's impossible. She's not married." "She is now." Thomas turned to Clara, his eyes holding hers. "Aren't you Mrs. Whitmore?" Clara understood what he was offering: protection, legitimacy, a name for her daughter. All she had to do was play along with the fiction. But the cost would be enormous, binding her to a man who deserved better than a marriage of convenience to a woman with a shameful past. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm Mrs. Whitmore." Jake's face twisted with fury. "You can't prove it. Where's the marriage certificate?" "Filed in the county seat," Thomas said smoothly. 3 days ago. Check the records if you want." Clara's mind reeled. Had Thomas actually married her? When? How? But she kept her expression neutral, playing the part of a devoted wife. The deputy who had spoken earlier looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Morrison, if she's legally married, that changes things. The child would be considered legitimate under the law." "This is a sham," Jake snarled. "A desperate attempt to keep me from what's rightfully mine." "What's rightfully yours," Thomas said, stepping closer to Jake, "is nothing. You abandoned Clara and the child. You forfeited any rights you might have had." For a moment, Clara thought Jake might resort to violence. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and she held her breath. But the presence of the deputies seemed to restrain him. Instead, he leaned close to Thomas, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't over, Whitmore. I know what kind of woman she is, and so will everyone else before I'm done. You'll regret taking her side." "The only thing I regret," Thomas replied evenly, is not running you off my land sooner." After the men had gone, Clara and Thomas stood in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling between them. Hope began to fuss in her basket, and Clara picked her up, holding her close. "Did you really?" Clara began. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "3 days ago, I rode to the county seat and filed the papers. I've been carrying them around, waiting for the right moment to tell you." Clara stared at him. "But why? You barely know me." "I know enough." Thomas's voice was gentle. "I know you're a good woman, who deserves better than what life has given you. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you love that baby more than your own life." He paused. "And I know that somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as just my housekeeper and started thinking of you as family. But Emma's gone, Clara. She's been gone for over a year, and I've been living like a ghost, just going through the motions. You brought this place back to life. You brought me back to life." He reached out tentatively, touching Hope's tiny hand. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm just asking you to stay, to let me be a father to this little girl, and a husband to you, even if it's only in name." Clara looked down at her daughter, then back at Thomas. She thought of Jake's cruel words, of the long months of loneliness and fear before she'd found this place. She thought of the kindness Thomas had shown her, the way he defended her without hesitation, the life he was offering. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "Maybe not," Thomas said with a slight smile, "but you've got it anyway." That evening, as Clara put Hope to bed in the cradle Thomas had built, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. A year ago, she had been a different person entirely, reckless, trusting, naive. That woman had made choices that led to disgrace and exile, but perhaps that woman had also led her here, to this moment, to this man who had offered her something she'd never expected to find: genuine acceptance. Over the following weeks, Clara and Thomas settled into their new reality as husband and wife. It was awkward at first, both of them uncertain about boundaries and expectations. Thomas had moved his things to the small room off the kitchen, insisting that Clara keep the main bedroom. They were careful around each other, polite and respectful, like strangers sharing a house. But gradually, as spring arrived and the ranch work intensified, they began to function as a true partnership. Thomas taught Clara to ride so she could help with the cattle, and she proved to have a natural affinity for the work. Together, they branded calves, mended fences, and prepared for the cattle drive that would take them to market. Hope thrived in the ranch environment, growing chubby and alert under the combined attention of her mother and the man who had claimed her as his own. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, fashioning toys from scraps of wood and spending hours talking to the baby, as if she could understand every word. It was during the cattle drive that Clara truly understood what Thomas had given her. The other ranchers' wives treated her as one of their own, sharing gossip and recipes and advice about child rearing. No one questioned her past or her legitimacy. She was simply Mrs. Whitmore, Thomas's wife, and that was enough. But it was also during the drive that Jake Morrison made his final play for revenge. He appeared at their camp one night, drunk and belligerent, demanding to see his child. This time, however, he wasn't alone. He'd brought a gang of men with him, all armed and dangerous. "I've been thinking about our last conversation, Whitmore," Jake slurred, swaying on his feet, "and I've decided I don't much care about your marriage papers. That child has my blood, and no piece of paper changes that." Thomas stepped forward, his own hand resting on his gun. "You're drunk, Morrison. Go sleep it off somewhere else." "Or what? You'll shoot me in front of all these witnesses?" Jake gestured to the other ranchers, who had emerged from their bedrolls at the commotion. "I don't think so." Clara clutched Hope closer, her heart pounding. She could see the calculation in Jake's eyes, the way he was measuring the odds, looking for an advantage. "You want to know the truth about your precious wife?" Jake called out, his voice carrying across the camp. "She was nothing but a saloon girl when I found her, a common whore who spread her legs for anyone with $1. The words hit Clara like physical blows, and she saw the other ranchers' wives exchange glances. The careful respectability she had built was crumbling in real time. "That's enough," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. "Oh, but I'm just getting started," Jake continued. Did she tell you about the other men? The ones before me? Did she tell you how she used to—" The sound of Thomas's fist connecting with Jake's jaw cut off the flow of venom. Jake stumbled backward, blood streaming from his nose. But he was grinning now, triumphant. "There's the violence I was hoping for," he said. "Now you've assaulted me in front of witnesses. I think that changes things, don't you?" But before Jake could continue, one of the other ranchers stepped forward, an older man named Samuel Hayes, who commanded respect throughout the territory. "What I saw," Hayes said loudly, "was a man defending his wife's honor against a drunk who was telling lies. Anyone else see it different?" There was a chorus of agreement from the other men, and Clara felt tears of gratitude burn her eyes. These people who barely knew her were choosing to stand with her. Jake's face darkened as he realized he'd miscalculated. The support he'd expected to find for his version of events had evaporated. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is," Thomas said. "If you come near my family again, I'll kill you. That's not a threat, it's a promise." Jake and his men rode away into the darkness, but Clara knew Thomas was right. It was over. Not because Jake had been defeated, but because she had finally found people who would stand with her, who saw value in her beyond her past mistakes. That night, as they lay in their separate bedrolls with Hope sleeping peacefully between them, Thomas spoke into the darkness. "I meant what I said about killing him if he comes back." "I know," Clara whispered. "I also meant what I said about this being over. He can't hurt you anymore, Clara. You're not alone." She turned to look at him in the starlight. "Why? Why would you risk so much for someone like me?" "Because you're not someone like you," Thomas said. "You're just you, and you're worth fighting for." When they returned to the ranch after a successful cattle drive, Clara felt like she was truly coming home for the first time in her life. The house that had once belonged to Thomas and Emma now felt like hers too, filled with the sounds of Hope's laughter and the quiet contentment of a family finding its rhythm. As summer faded into autumn, Clara began to notice changes in herself that had nothing to do with her circumstances. She was stronger now, more confident. The work of ranch life had toughened her body and her spirit. She could rope a calf, doctor a sick cow, and ride for hours without complaint. But more than that, she had learned to see herself through different eyes, not as a fallen woman deserving of scorn, but as someone capable of redemption and growth. It was during the first snow of winter that Clara finally understood what had been growing between her and Thomas all along. She had been putting Hope to bed when she heard the sound of his guitar from the main room, something he rarely did anymore since Emma's death. The melody was haunting and beautiful, and she found herself drawn to the doorway to listen. When the song ended, Thomas looked up and saw her there. "Emma used to like that one," he said softly. "It's beautiful," Clara replied, meaning it. She had a voice like an angel, used to sing while she worked in the garden. Thomas set the guitar aside. "I haven't played much since she died. Seemed wrong somehow." Clara stepped into the room, understanding suddenly what he was trying to tell her. "She wouldn't want you to stop making music." "No, she wouldn't." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "She wouldn't want me to stop living either." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara felt her heart begin to race as she understood what he was saying. "Clara," Thomas said, rising from his chair, "I need to tell you something. These past months, watching you with Hope, working alongside you, building something together, it's changed me. I know I said I wasn't asking you to love me, but I'm asking now." Clara's breath caught. "Thomas!" "I love you," he said simply. "Not because I'm grateful to you, not because I'm lonely, but because of who you are. Your strength, your courage, the way you've never given up no matter what life threw at you. I love the way you sing to Hope when you think no one is listening. I love the way you touch my hand when you pass me coffee in the morning. I love the life we've built together." Clara felt tears streaming down her face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for months, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid you'd think I was just grateful for your protection." Thomas crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Are you just grateful?" "No," Clara said, looking into his eyes. "I'm grateful, yes, but it's so much more than that. You saved me, Thomas, but not in the way you think. You didn't just give me shelter and a name. You gave me back my sense of worth. You made me believe I deserved happiness. When Thomas kissed her, it was with a tenderness that took her breath away. This was nothing like the rough demands she had known before. This was love, patient, respectful, transformative. That night, for the first time since their paper marriage, they shared a bed as true husband and wife. And in the morning, Clara woke to find Thomas already up, making breakfast and singing softly to Hope, who gurgled with delight at the attention. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, kissing Clara's forehead as she joined them in the kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, and for the first time, the words felt completely true. Spring brought news that Jake Morrison had been killed in a barroom brawl in another territory, finally closing the chapter on that part of Clara's past. She felt no joy at the news, only a quiet relief that Hope would never have to face questions about her parentage. On Hope's first birthday, the house was full of neighbors and friends who had come to celebrate. Clara watched her daughter take her first wobbling steps across the parlor floor, reaching for Thomas with complete trust and love. In that moment, Clara understood that the name Thomas had given her, Whitmore, was more than just legal protection. It was a promise kept, a future claimed, a family chosen rather than simply born into. That evening, as they cleaned up from the party, Thomas pulled Clara aside. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small wooden box. Inside was a simple gold ring, worn smooth with age. "It was my grandmother's," Thomas explained. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Emma. Emma always said it should go to the woman who made this house a home again." Clara's hands trembled as Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. "Emma told me once that love isn't just about holding on to someone," Thomas said. "Sometimes it's about letting go so they can find what they need. I think she would be happy that her ring is with you now." Clara looked around the room that had become her sanctuary, at the cradle where Hope slept peacefully, at the guitar propped in the corner, at the photographs of Emma that still graced the mantelpiece. She had been afraid that loving Thomas meant erasing his first wife's memory, but now she understood that love could expand to honor the past while embracing the future. "What would you like to name the next one?" Thomas asked, his hand resting on Clara's still flat stomach. Clara smiled, not bothering to ask how he knew. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father. If it's a girl," she paused, thinking of all the names that had been taken from her and given back, all the identities she had shed and claimed. "Faith," she said finally. "I'd like to name her Faith." As the years passed, Clara often thought about the woman she had been when she first walked into Redemption Creek. Frightened, alone, carrying nothing but shame and the promise of new life. That woman had been looking for a place to hide, but she had found something far more valuable, a place to heal, to grow, to become the person she was meant to be. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, growing from a struggling operation to one of the most successful in the territory. Hope grew into a bright, confident child who could ride before she could properly walk and who called Thomas Papa with the unconscious certainty of a daughter who had never known anything but love. Faith, when she arrived 2 years later, was followed by 2 more children, Samuel and Emma, named for the old rancher who had stood up for Clara and Thomas's first wife, respectively. The house rang with laughter and the comfortable chaos of a large family. But perhaps the most precious gift was the quiet evening moments when Clara and Thomas would sit on the porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the endless prairie. In those moments, Clara would sometimes touch the ring on her finger and marvel at the journey that had brought her here. She had been a woman with no name and no future, discarded by a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenience. But Thomas had seen something different. Not perfection, but potential. Not a woman without past, but a woman worthy of a future. The loneliness that had once consumed her had been replaced by the deep satisfaction of belonging somewhere, of being essential to the lives of people she loved. The shame that had driven her from town to town had been transformed into strength, the knowledge that she had survived the worst life could offer and found grace on the other side. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Clara with a trip to the county seat, where he had filed their marriage papers all those years ago. They stood in the courthouse, reading the document that had changed everything, and Clara marveled at the simple words that had given her back her life. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as they walked hand in hand down the street where it all began. "Regret what?" "Taking a chance on me, giving me your name when you barely knew me." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her. "Clara, you gave me far more than I ever gave you. You brought my house back to life. You gave me children to love and raise. You showed me that it was possible to honor Emma's memory while still choosing to live." He cupped her face in his hands. "You saved me every bit as much as I saved you." As they drove home in their wagon, the familiar landscape rolling past them, Clara reflected on the truth of his words. They had saved each other, not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but through the daily choice to see the best in one another, to offer grace instead of judgment, to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate lives. The sun was setting as they reached the ranch, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that Clara had come to associate with home. Their children ran out to greet them, and Hope, now a young woman of 10, took charge of her younger siblings with the natural authority of an eldest child. That night, as Clara tucked each child into bed and kissed them goodnight, she thought about the legacy she was leaving them. Not just the ranch, not just the financial security, but something far more valuable: the knowledge that redemption was possible, that love could heal the deepest wounds, that a person's past did not have to define their future. When she finally joined Thomas in their bedroom, he was already reading by lamplight, his hair now touched with silver, but his eyes still holding the same warmth that had seen through her defenses all those years ago. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, setting his book aside. "Everything," Clara said, settling beside him. "The day I walked into town, the first time I saw you, the moment you told Jake Morrison I was your wife. How different everything might have been if Mrs. Henderson hadn't told me about a lonely rancher who needed help." "Mrs. Henderson always said she was just a matchmaker in disguise," Thomas said with a chuckle. "She claims she knew the moment she saw you that you belonged here." "Did you?" "No, I mean—" Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I knew you were running from something. I knew you were afraid, but trying to be brave. I knew you needed help, and I knew I was in a position to give it." He paused. "But falling in love with you, that was a surprise. The best surprise of my life." Clara leaned against his shoulder, comfortable in the easy intimacy they had built over years of shared struggles and triumphs. "I used to think my life was over when I had to leave the last town. I thought I'd used up all my chances, that I'd never find anywhere I belonged. And now? Now I know that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need." Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain and the promise of another growing season. In a few months, it would be time for the spring roundup, then the summer cattle drive, then the harvest that would sustain them through another winter. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. But Clara no longer saw her life as a series of endless cycles leading nowhere. Instead, she saw it as a spiral, each turn bringing her higher, closer to the person she was meant to become. The woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek with nothing but secrets and shame had been transformed into someone who could offer wisdom to other lost souls, who could stand as proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to accept it. As she drifted off to sleep in the arms of the man who had given her his name and changed everything forever, Clara whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected turns that had led her here. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the love she had found. But tonight, she was simply Clara Whitmore, beloved wife and mother, woman of substance and worth. The lonely rancher had indeed given her his name, but in doing so, he had given her something far more precious: the chance to write a new story, one where love conquered shame, where acceptance healed old wounds, where two broken people could create something whole and lasting together. In the end, that was all anyone really needed. Not perfection, but the possibility of redemption. Not a life without struggle, but someone willing to stand beside them through whatever came. Claire had found that in Thomas, and together they had built something that would outlast them both. A family, a legacy, a love story that proved that sometimes the best things in life came not from what you were born with, but from what you chose to become.